everyone. My name is Seydou Dia, and I work as an energy data officer here within the annual oil statistics team with Julien Bonnet here and Daniel and other colleagues. So throughout the next 20 minutes or so, we'll be talking about oil statistics. So I'll be covering three main topics. I'll talk about key oil trends, then we'll be talking about the key concepts behind oil statistics, and finally, we'll focus on how to report data in the questionnaires. So before starting, there will be a lot of content in this presentation. So of course, at the end, if you have questions or during the exercise, we can come back to some of the elements I will be mentioning. So starting with key oil trends, so let's start by focusing on energy supply. So here on the left-hand side, you can see two pie charts with energy supply by energy source. And if we compare 1973 and 2022, we can see that oil remains the largest source of energy supply at approximately 30% in 2022, followed by coal and natural gas. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the United States have been, well, now for quite some years, the top oil producers in the world, followed by Saudi Arabia, the Russian Federation. And we see other countries that have increased their production, such as Canada, Brazil, Iraq, to only mention a few. So of course, crude needs to be refined in order to be consumed. And here you have world refinery output by product, but also by region. And during the pandemic, we can see that refinery output declined, but rebounded back in 2021 and 2022. And we expect such trends in 2023 and 2024, of course. So in terms of world refinery output by products, on the left, we see, of course, that historically, the majority are motor gasoline and metal distillates, which includes diesel, and which are mostly consumed in the transport sector. We also see that fuel output has been declining as a result of new regulations in several countries or international mandates requiring the use of cleaner fuels in industry or marine bunkers. So focusing now on the right-hand side of the slides, when we look at refinery output by region, we can see that Americas and Europe saw more or less no appreciable change since the 90s. And on the other hand, a lot of the growth in refining activities in Asia, and the region is expected to be the main will drive growth for refinery output. And of course, this leads us to demand, where again, as we would have expected, historically, the main product consumed is for road transport. And this is followed by non-energy use, which refers mostly to the use of oil as feedstock. And again, for several years, growth has been driven by non-OECD, and we expect the same behavior in the coming years. So let's move forward with the key concepts of oil statistics. So I'll go through some of, as I was saying before, some of the elements talking about product classification, flows that need to be reported, and we can come back to it. So there'll be a lot of information, but please bear with me and we'll talk about that later on. So when it comes to the classification, we make a distinction between primary oil products and secondary oil products, and the link between them being the refinery. So on the side of primary oil products, these correspond to products that are extracted and from the earth and go to refineries, but not only, as we also consider secondary products that could go to refineries, such as additives and refinery feedstock. And on the other side, when we look at secondary products, these are products that have been refined and that can be consumed either in the transformation sector or the final consumption sector. So when it comes to the specification of products, it is important to note that, as I was mentioning, we have additives and refinery feedstock that are also inputs to refineries. But if we look a bit deeper in these two products, they have other components that I will come back to later. So before moving on to the next part, let me just touch a few words on condensates. So condensates are high quality, light and versatile oil that needs fewer refining processes before using. So condensates can be used directly as a petrochemical feedstock, for example, to produce synthetic material. So we have two types of condensates. We have what we call field condensates, which are recovered from the field in associated or non-associated gas reservoirs in the oil questionnaire. But we also have what we call plant condensates that are recovered in natural gas processing plants or separation facilities that are also reported in the oil annual questionnaires as NGLs. And finally, we have other hydrocarbons, but I come back to that later. Now, oil can be classified, can be further classified when we look at its physical properties. Of course, we know that we have the density. So most oil is lighter than water, but we can have heavy oil that have higher density than water. So one thing to take into account is when you're collecting data is to pay attention to the density, because oil will differ, could differ from its composition and the output you may have when it goes through the refinery. So one other thing is what we call API. So this is also an indication of your density that can also be a good indicator when you're collecting data. Secondly, we have what we call the sulfur content. So sulfur is an impurity present in oil. And when it is processed, usually we try to remove the sulfur from crude oil. So it can varies from 0.05% to 5%, depending on the crude. And generally, the higher the density of the crude, the greater the sulfur content will be. So low sulfur crudes are often referred to as sweet crude, while high sulfur varieties are called sour crude. And of course, as you may have guessed, the sweeter the crude, the higher its price. And finally, we have the energy content, since in the end, we're trying to build an energy balance, which you will see tomorrow. We collect also net calorific values. And you could have a calorific value for production, for imports, for exports, but you could also compute an average calorific value that needs to be a weighted average so that it's representative of the oil or the crude oil that enters your economy. So now that we've seen these three characteristics of oil, as I was saying before, depending on the physical and chemical properties, you would have different outputs. So non-OPEC crudes tend to be lighter crudes, whereas, non-OPEC crudes are lighter crudes, yes, and sweeter, whereas OPEC crudes tend to be heavier and sour. And so moving on to the topic of refineries, depending on the crude oil that will be fed into your refinery, you should have specific outputs in terms of proportions. And here we just took an example of some data where we see that in 2011, we had an important increase in metal distillates, and this in appearance is an anomaly. So we would usually get back to the refinery to confirm it. So maybe a processing unit was shut down, or it's simply a data entry error. So now we're reaching the part where we'll be talking about the balance. So we talked about the products, but when it comes to the reporting of the different flows, we also make this distinction between supply of primary oil products and supply of secondary oil products. So of course, first you have indigenous production, which is the extraction of primary oil production from the earth, whether offshore or onshore, from different types of well, either association with natural gas or not. And as I was mentioning before, you should only report marketable production. So you should exclude volumes returned to formation when extracting crude oil. So such production should include all crude oil, NGL, condensates, but also oil from shale, tar sands, etc. And we shouldn't forget as well, as I was mentioning before, additive oxygenates in refineries and blending plants from outside the refining sector. So it's important to really identify your point of measurement in order to report proper indigenous production. As you can see here, as I was mentioning, you have crude oil field and condensate, and you have natural gas liquids and plant condensates. But of course, associated gases should remain in the natural gas balance. Now moving on from other sources. So this is the supply of liquids whose production has already been covered in other fuel balances. So for example, when we're talking about biofuels, which are blending with transport fuels, their production is reported in the renewable questionnaires and can be entered in the oil questionnaires via other flows that I will introduce later. We have trades that should reflect the amount of products that have crossed the national boundaries, whether custom clearance has taken place or not. But one thing important is that it shouldn't include transit trade. So we should only report data that will enter the economy for consumption, or if we're talking about primary oil products that will be considered as refinery intake or stock change. Well, stock change, as its name indicates, it's a flow that enables us to reflect stock that is built or drawn, and stocks within the scope of annual oil statistics should only reflect stocks held on national territory, which might differ for monthly oil statistics. And finally, we have one very important flow that is backflows, which is a flow for finished or semi-finished products, which are returned from final consumers to refineries for processing, blending, or sale. So they are usually a byproduct of transformation in petrochemical manufacturing. So here, after the delivery of all products, you could have products that are going back to the refinery via the backflows. So this is something also that we are tracking in our annual statistics. And we have the flow of direct use that I will introduce later, but this is in relation with mostly biofuels, or in some cases, natural gas liquids. For example, if you have a receipt from other sources of biofuels, it can directly be used for the consumption. So now that we've seen the supply of primary oil products, let's move on to the supply of secondary products. I didn't introduce the notion of product transfers because I think it's a lot, but I will introduce it in the next slide. And of course, everything is going to the refinery. So if we follow our data points, so it goes from the production, all of the flows to the refinery, and then we have the outputs of secondary oil products. And if we look at all the different flows, just quickly, we have, of course, your refinery gross outputs, which is the production of finished products. And this category will exclude refinery losses, but will include refinery fuel that includes all petroleum products consumed in support of the operation of refinery and are used for the production at refineries of electricity and heat. One other flow that is very important is interproduct transfer. And this is the result of a reclassification of products, either because their specification has changed or because they are blended into another product. So just to share with you a very quick example, you could have a transfer from kerosene to gasoil or jet kerosene to diesel. So usually the interproduct transfer will occur from lighter products to heavier oil products, and the opposite is not likely to happen. And as you can see, when we're collecting data, usually it's either kerosene to gasoil, naphtha to gasoline, and you also have other cases that are less likely. Then product transferred. So as I was mentioning on the previous slide, product transfers here allows the movement of a secondary oil products which have not yet been delivered to final consumers to be reported as feedstock to be reprocessed in the refinery. So here, for example, so unlike the other slide, so the arrow here means that it's going towards the top of the slide. So it will not be delivered it will not be included in gross inland deliveries, and it will be discounted from the supply. And again, you have primary product receipts, and this is in relation with direct use that I also introduced earlier. So to give you an example, if you have biofuel that is coming from the renewable questionnaires, it can be reported as direct use, and it will appear here on the supply side of secondary oil products as primary product receipts. And finally, we have recycled products that correspond to products that pass a second time through the marketing network after having been processed and delivered to the final consumers. And we have international marine bunkers that I will come back to later on, but these represent the supply of secondary oil products to international marine bunkers, which is a convention in the oil data collection, and they are removed from gross inland deliveries. And again, you have trades and stocks, but I already introduced these notions before. And all of those flows enable us to compute gross inland deliveries that will include final consumption and transformation. So again, this was a lot of information, and I will come back to it. We will come back to it, Julia and I, during the exercises, just so that you understand the different flows. So just to sum up, you have primary oil products, and in a way, secondary oil products through feedstock that are reported as refinery intake. And then you have the production of secondary finished oil products as refinery gross output. Now, talking about refineries, losses can occur during the refining process. So refinery intake should be greater than refinery gross output, since in theory you should have refinery losses as long as you work in mass units. But this is not always the case, depending on which unit you are working in. So if you're working in volume units, you could have lighter products that have greater volumes when the crude has gone through the refinery. So this could happen, but this is why when we collect data, we always work with kilotons. And when collecting your data, you should be careful that at least you should make sure that refinery yield is below 100%. And if you have refinery gains, which could happen when you collect your data, this means that this should be corrected. So the next slides, we're coming back to international marine bunkers that I introduced earlier. So here, what is really important to remember is that what we call international marine bunker corresponds to ships that are leaving one country to another country. So we're not considering the flag of the country, but the port of departure and the port of arrival. So it's really important to collect this data and to report it properly, as 80% of global trade in physical goods is done by sea. And the distinction between national and international navigation matters for emissions calculation, as international marine bunkers are excluded from national inventories. And now reaching the end of the introduction to the oil balance, when we look at final consumption, you have several sectors going from electricity plants, chemical and petrochemical, aviation, road transport, navigation, residential. And depending on which sectors we're working with, the products that will be reported, consumed, will differ. But we will come back to it during the exercise session. So now, reaching the end of the presentation and the last section for reporting data for the questionnaires. So I'll just go through the structure. So in the questionnaire, we have 6 different types of table. So you have table 1 for the supply of primary oil products. You have table 2 for the supply of secondary oil products. We have 2A and 2B, which is used to report the data for the petrochemical sector. Then we have deliveries for sectoral energy and non-energy use, and finally trades and refinery capacities. So of course, there are relations between this table, and when reporting data, we are making sure that we have consistencies. Of course, total imports and exports reported in table 1 should match what you have in table 4 and 5, but you also should be careful between inter-questionnaires consistencies. So for example, everything that is reported on the renewable side should match what we have on the oil side when it comes to receipts from other sources, just to give you an example. One other topic that is important when working with the questionnaire is natural gas liquids. So when working with natural gas liquids, as you may or may not know, natural gas liquids consist of ethane, propane, butane, pentane, pentane plus, and heavier fractions are often further processed in refinery, so are included in refinery intake, whereas lighter fractions are generally used directly. So this can also be reflected in the questionnaires. So if we take the first example of natural gas liquids processed in a refinery, it will be reported as production, then as refinery intake, and then you would have a certain quantity of non-biogasoline output. But you also have other cases where natural gas liquids is used directly. So you would again have production reported, but this time it will be reported as direct use. And finally, you would have it as gross inland deliveries with the use of primary product receipts flow. But you can also have the use of interproduct transfer, as I was mentioning earlier, where the product can be transferred to another product. In this case, it's LPG. And as I was mentioning, again, biofuels are a really important component of the whole questionnaire since it's linked with the renewables one. So here you have an example of how we could use the direct use flow. So on the renewable side, you would have production of pure biofuels that is reported for blending, and then it will appear as receipt from other sources, then direct use. And finally, on the supply side of secondary products, you would have the same amounts that would be reported here in gross inland deliveries calculated. And I'm taking this opportunity to talk about the reporting of biofuels when it comes to trade. On the oil side, you should only report biofuels that are imported if they are intended for blending or already blended with fossil fuels, whereas on the renewable side, you only have trade of pure biofuels. And finally, the last aspect of the whole questionnaire, which is the petrochemical sector. So I won't go through in details, and if you have questions, I can come back to it. But really what you need to understand is that in the balance, what we collect as inputs and outputs are on the input side, you have energy and non-energy use. So all of the deliveries to the petrochemical sectors are reported. But when it comes to energy use output, this is something that we will be collecting. But all of the products that are consumed for non-energy outputs going to the petrochemical sector is not reported. And this is the boundary of oil statistics. So this was the last slide. And if you want additional information, of course, I can come back to it during the questions. And we have several resources on our website, of course, in relation with oil, but also other reports if you're looking for markets information or outlooks in relation with this fuel. And again, everything that has been presented is available in the manuals, and questionnaires and reporting instructions are available. So I know that it was a lot of information, and I can come back to any slides or if you have any questions.